Hello and welcome back to the Happy Running Podcast. My name's Drew, and I'm here with Matt Fox, the founder of Sweat Elite and the Sweat Elite Coaching Academy. Thanks for joining, Matt.
Thanks so much, Drew. I appreciate the invitation. We've been chatting about doing this for a little while, and it was awesome to do some running with you back in Flagstaff, where you're based, back in, was it May and June, I think? And yeah,
Yeah,
it's been good to chat with you about training and all things for quite some time now. So honored to be on the podcast and looking forward to talking about marathoning and everything else.
yeah, for sure. Yeah, and one of the things I want to highlight today is uh, kind of where I came from in terms of running background or like no running background, and then also your running background, how you transitioned into now running a large media company where you're very, prominent in the sport, and you put out a ton of content that kind of guided me through part of my, the learnings that I've taken from running. So, I guess my first question for you is like, how'd you start? Were you a runner from the get-go, or did you transition, and what did that look like?
Yeah, sure. So my running journey truly started about 20 years ago, which makes me sound quite old. I'm 37 now, but at the age of 17, I was, before 17, I was competing in mostly in sprints, but I wasn't taking it very seriously. My heart was really in the Australian football up until the age of 17, and I was really determined to try and make that league in Australia, which is a big deal in Australia. And in that year, the last year of high school, and when I was 17 years old, I sustained a very serious critical injury in my wrist where I broke it in multiple locations and I was out for the whole year playing football. And so my original motivation to start running was actually to be as fit as I possibly could for the next Australian football season, because the Australian Football League placed pretty heavy weighting when it came to drafting to clubs on 3K time trial, 400-meter time trial, and all these sorts of running events. And so I thought, my only hope to make the Australian Football League next year is to get as fit as I can in running. And towards the end of that year, so I basically started training pretty seriously in about May of that year, April or May. And then in December, I came fifth at the Australian national champs in the 800 meters in high school. So not in the open division, in the high school. And around the same time, November, December, I got news that there was basically pretty much no chance of me being drafted to a club based because of my injury. So yeah, that sort of led me down a path of thinking, what's next? Should I focus on running? And if you're coming in the top, say, 8 in the country as a high schooler, I guess your sights are automatically set to being like, can I possibly make the Olympics? Can I possibly make the world champs? And so ultimately, so this was 2004, end of 2004, I did my best to try and qualify for the London and Beijing Olympics. So Beijing being 2008 and London being 2012. And ultimately, I didn't make either of those teams, but I was fifth in the country in the open division twice. I was very good at coming fifth in Australia. And yeah, I guess I met a whole lot of people through, that sort of 8 to 9 year journey. But in 2013, when I stopped competing in the middle distances, I really felt like my middle distance career was a bit of a failure, which in retrospect is a bit silly because, getting to a position of being quite close to qualifying for the Olympics is certainly not a failure. But because that was my goal and I didn't hit it, I thought, what am I missing? Like, what have I missed? How do I learn more about running? And how do I, because I think I also started meeting people that also were curious about learning more about training. And so that led me down a path of interviewing a lot of athletes a lot better than me. And then ultimately, after taking a few full-time jobs up between 2013 and 2016, in 2016, I came back to the entire idea that I'd had for a while to create a sort of media company that would really try and understand how to improve in the realm of running via interviewing professional runners and coaches and sort of sharing that information with the public. Because at the time, like you might not know this, Drew, I'm curious to hear your thoughts actually. But at least back then in 2013 to 16, there was very little resources about running training. There was a few books in bookstores and in libraries from Seb Coe and the like, but there wasn't that. It was almost like a lot of the training was quite secretive. And so I sort of made it my mission, and other people did around the world as well, to sort of not make it so secretive and blow the doors open. And now Strava has made a big impact there because a lot of pros are logging on Strava. But yeah, I started running marathons in 2017. I just sort of got pulled into it originally via a challenge. One of my friends thought that I couldn't break 3 hours because he thought that I was too much of a sprinter. And yeah, that sort of led me down the marathon, the marathon journey. And here we are 7 years after the first marathon. I think it's 7.5 years trying to run PBs still to this day, and it's been an awesome journey, full of ups and downs, loads of ups. But it's led me to meet people like yourself and many other awesome people in the running community, and I think that's probably one of the best parts of it too, to be honest, the friends that you make along the way. But yeah, I've
Yeah.
really sort of paraphrased the last 20 years in a couple of minutes there.
Yeah, that's great. I'm curious, like, was it passion for running that led you to kind of get into it and then keep going? Or do you think it was your competitive nature of being an athlete and seeing that you can perform and then wanting to just kind of take more?
That is a really good question. I think originally it was the competitive side in me, and I think that's slowly morphed into a passion as well, because now it's absolutely more of a, I'd say it's equally a passion and a competitive nature. But back when I
Yeah.
was 18, it was more about competitive nature for sure. I don't think I was a true love. I probably wasn't a true lover of running originally in the first couple of years. It was really it was all about trying to qualify for the Olympics. And to be honest, in 2013, when I stopped running middle distance, I had a bunch of injuries in my hamstring that year. At the time, I wasn't super sure if I would keep running for much longer. But yeah, really glad I did, and really glad I've gone down this journey of hitting the marathon because it's such a fascinating scene.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, myself included, it's like you start running for whatever reason. It's not often that people are just runners from the get-go. Even people like a lot of the elite athletes, women, they play soccer here. That's a really common entry to it. Uh, but even for me, I remember my first 5K, which was probably my first thing that I did that was running related in my life. Was 2017, so the same year you got into marathoning, and I did like terrible training. Thinking back, I think I ran like 1 mile every few days and as hard as I could, and had no idea what I was doing. My calves would always hurt, my Achilles always hurt. I thought that was normal. And so I think a lot of people get into running thinking like, man, this is painful. This really sucks. And then as you learn more about it, or as you maybe get like a little bit of the bug and learn how to do it the right way, then you start to develop a passion for it. So I feel like that's almost normal.
Yeah, I'd agree with that entirely. So it
Yeah.
sounds like you took the pure quality approach originally, just all speed work.
Yes. Involuntarily. Yeah, exactly.
I like
There,
it.
there wasn't a lot of thought that went into it. My CMO at the time that I was working for, he was like a triathlete guy, and CMO, so he's obviously like he's driven, and he just throws out to the office to everyone, "Hey, who wants to do a 5K?" And it was outside at an airport outside of our office at the time, and and I was the only one who signed up, and then he didn't even show up that day, so I was the only one who actually showed up. And then by the last probably like 400 meters, I was just like so unfit that I felt like I was going to pass out, like the walls start coming in,
Oh yeah.
and my breathing was horrific and my heart rate was probably like 190, which I can't even get it up to these days. And it was terrible. But after I did it, I was like, oh, I think it was like 21 minutes for 5K. And
That's
I was
pretty
like,
good.
oh, that's like not bad. All right, And I was terribly unfit.
Yeah.
Zero exercise. I lifted weights, but no real aerobic exercise.
I love the way your CMO pumped you up and then he didn't turn up. That's pretty cheeky.
I know. I'm still upset about it. I won't throw his name out there.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's awesome, man. Thanks for sharing.
of course.
Yeah, I had like a little bit of a different path. I probably started running like that was about 6 or 7 years ago at this point, and I did my first marathon CIM in 2019. I ran 3:29. So that's relevant because I didn't start transitioning to more of like a serious training regimen until probably 3 years ago. And right around that time was when I was considering moving away from California, mostly like economic reasons. Just wanted to afford a home and kind of have you know, a typical like American dream type of life, buy a home and have kids and whatever. And that led me to Arizona. And simultaneously, I'm like getting into running. I'm watching your channel, which I think I probably started watching like right after that marathon. When did you start Sweat Elite again?
I started
YouTube.
Sweat Elite the YouTube in May 2021.
Okay, so I probably started watching like right when you started it. I think it
Yeah.
was right after that marathon, and that was right before I moved to Arizona. And I just started watching these videos going, oh, there's so much to the sport. There's so many things that these people are doing. Maybe if I just bite off a little bit here and incorporate some of these things into my own training, I can change my life from just being a 9 to 5 worker and kind of struggling to fit things in to really understanding what I'm doing and having intention uh behind what I'm doing. So that was like your channel actually led me to doing that. And then I saw you at Buffalo Park in whatever that was, like a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, and introduced myself. And then we kind of like met up again after that. And yeah, I mean, it's been great. So anyway, all that aside, I'm kind of curious, like you have all this experience building running content, um, interviewing people, and I'm sure you've kind of got that down to a science. What are the types of questions that you try and ask people to really not just like get really quick answers, but like really connect with what their thought process is in training and understand how to relay that over to normal people like me?
Yeah. I think ultimately I've drawn a lot of inspiration from a podcaster called Tim Ferriss. Are you familiar with Tim Ferriss?
I am.
Yeah, I have a feeling I actually might have spoke with you very briefly about that when I was with you in Flagstaff. But yeah, I listened to his podcast very early on when he started. It would have been about 2013, 2014. And I loved the way that he discussed so he basically has a podcast, nothing to do with running. It's all to do with successful people in a particular industry or realm. It can be sport or business or art. And then he really tries to dissect and understand what motivates them and what specific sort of habits and strategies they have at any sort of level that will help them achieve their success. And I really just basically took that idea and applied it to running. So I kind of copied his entire podcast idea, but just went, I'm going to do that with running. And so almost all of my questioning, if people have noticed, if you really look at it through this lens, is about why do people do it? What motivates them? What drives them to do it? And it can be a range of things. It can be something that happened to them when they were younger, like something that inspired them when they were younger. It can be financial reasons. It can be health reasons. It can be all sorts of things. And then I try and dive into the specifics around what exactly is it that you do that you have been led to believe that helps you move the needle forward and improve in that endeavor. And so almost all of my questioning and the content is around that sort of that corner. And I think for the most part, it's a little bit selfish, I would say, in that I do that to some extent so that I can learn. But then I also think a lot of people listening will also learn. And I never forget hearing Tim Ferriss actually say that a lot of his questioning is selfish. It's that what he wants to know to apply to himself, but he figured that a lot of people will also want to know that. And so a lot of other podcasts out there tend to ask about how do they get into running, all these different things, their background story. And that's great too, because that often has an overlap with what the line of questioning that I ask. But I really try and dig into the specifics around what has this person learned over the years, or can be decades in some cases, that they believe is absolutely critical to their success. And then I try and pull that out and then share it with the internet, the people listening or watching. It depends if it's on YouTube or on podcasts. And yeah, I think it's something that a lot of other people are doing well now as well. And I guess I'm proud to say and think that I was one of the earlier ones doing that in running around 2016, 2017. But there was already still, FlowTrack were already, I mean, they'd been doing Workout Wednesday videos already for quite some time at that point. So you could argue that they were probably the first. But yeah, everything is really around that because I think, I think I fundamentally don't believe that if someone discovers the training program of Eliud Kipchoge, I don't think that gives Eliud Kipchoge much of a disadvantage, really, because talent plays a huge role in running, and also the environment that you're in and the people that you have around you play a huge role. And someone like Kipchoge has, a perfect environment around him. He has a perfect set of training partners and coaches and stuff. And to replicate that and to do his training, I don't think anyone's ever going to challenge him just if they have their training plan right. So what I'm saying is I'm not really quite sure if there is such thing as a running secret really anymore. You could argue that maybe before 2014, 2015, maybe there was some particular workouts that you want to keep to yourself. But I think they've all sort of been discovered now and debunked and not debunked, wrong word, but just discovered and shared enough. So yeah, we're in a cool phase. And I think in part, that discovering and learning about how to become great and become the best you can does inspire people to do it. And I think, the running boom right now is massive. And you're a prime example of someone that started playing around in the running space probably before the boom, but then once the boom really kicked off, you've started taking it seriously. And I didn't realize that you started at 3:29. I knew it was well over 3 hours, but you've just taken off over an hour from your personal best, which is pretty phenomenal. That's a long time. So yeah, good for you, man. And
Thanks.
yeah, I hope I answered the question.
You did. Yeah.
Yeah.
And uh it's interesting the going back to like your format for podcast. I guess you took it from podcasting but related into content. I do think that that is really a great formula for any creator of anything. And just really understanding, because you know your niche, whatever like market you represent. I think everyone does kind of represent their own little market of consumers and viewers. And by really understanding that, you know exactly what people are going to be looking for, people like you. And that's something I've been trying to incorporate too with starting my own YouTube channel, is like people come up to me all the time and ask me questions. And I'm like, I almost feel unqualified to answer things, but I also know that I've been through so many successes and failures over the last like 5 years, really, um, that do lead me to be somewhat qualified to answer these things. And I'm interested in sharing it. And I'm not interested in like, you know, like clout online or whatever. It's just, I want people to have answers to their questions and have it come easier than it came for me,
Yeah.
which I do think it was kind of an inflection point almost in the running space. Was like right when you started the channel, it was almost perfectly timed, because things just slowly started to take off. More influencers began getting into running, not just in distance running, but also people like Nick Bear, which, no matter what you think about Nick Bear, he's kind of a meathead type. People think he's on testosterone or whatever, but he's a really driven hard worker. He knows how to run. He's trained by people who really know what they're doing. And also, he runs this big media company. He has his supplements. He's got his family and stuff. So I think there's a lot of people like that are admirable people, and people go to them for trust and confidence in products and lifestyle, whatever. And it's one of the beautiful things of the internet is people like you can influence people who are not, maybe not being their best selves, and influence them in a way where they can be really successful. So that's really cool.
Yeah, you said it really well there. And Nick Bear has really been one of the sort of leaders in the space, I would argue, for the last 5 years. And yeah, put
Absolutely.
aside put aside what he may or may not be putting in his body. I mean, he makes phenomenal content, and that doesn't really the other question doesn't really matter, right? Because the quality of his content and the way in which he shares the journey as well is very powerful. So yeah, and it's cool. There are a lot of people doing it out there right now. I think a lot of people are noticing that, and I think the unfortunate side of that is there's a lot of envy that comes with that. Sadly, a
Totally.
lot. And the faster you grow and the bigger you grow, you're going to get a little bit of that, and that's something that's nothing personal either. I think that's one thing that you have to really fully understand. It's actually not personal. I've really learned that. So yeah, it's a cool place, and it's only growing. So it'd be cool to see where we're at in about 5 to 10 years.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so some of those questions that I get, that I try and answer, I want to kind of relay those questions over to you now. So
Hmm.
thinking about like the average runner, what do you think are some low hanging fruit, anything that you've learned from people who are performing at a high level, where you can easily translate that into really quick, either marginal gains or large gains from small movements and changes in lifestyle or training?
Yeah, I think probably the biggest thing, which is probably very simple to you and I, and I see you do this very well actually, is you have a very, and I do too, I have a very polarized approach to the paces in training. And so what I mean by that is we do our easy runs quite easy and we do our hard workouts quite hard. And that's something that I often see people go wrong in their early days of running. They think everything should be hard. And they almost think that a 60, 70, 80 minute, even a 40-minute run at a slow pace is the sort of the natural conclusion that might come to your mind is, what's the point in doing this? Like it's too easy. Am I getting anything out of it if it's easy? But you learn over time when you really start to study the science of running that it's really critical to do a lot of easy sort of zone one or zone two. Those two zones are both important running. And That's the biggest thing I've learned. If you want to give advice to someone that's relatively new, because most people that start just assume that running steady and hard every day is the way to get fitter and faster, when in fact that's just not true. But intuitively speaking, you would think that's true. You would think that running 5 days a week hard for 5 to 10K and finishing at threshold every day is the quickest way to fitness, but it's actually not. It's actually far better to be doing that once or twice a week and the other three runs at an easier pace. You will actually see, well, firstly, you'll have a lot less chance of picking up an injury that way. You'll have a lot higher chance of picking up an injury if you're going hard every day or even 4 or 5 days a week. And you'll also notice that your long-term progression, in fact, you might actually see some fast progression quickly if you run hard most days of the week, but that will very quickly start to stagnate and slow down. And you'll probably also find you have symptoms of overtraining, probably poor sleep, etc. Whereas if you sort of really hit the polarized approach and do two runs that are, you know, let's just take someone, for example, that's running their steady state runs at like 8 minute mile pace. You're much better doing the other 3 days at like 10 to 10:30 mile pace. You actually get a lot more out of that in the longer term. So that's probably the most simple thing, but sometimes I think that's even too simple. But I see even quite good runners making that mistake. I recently came across, I'm not going to say names, but I recently became aware of a runner through a friend who's a very good runner from Singapore. She's already run sub 3, but I noticed on Strava after following her, lovely girl, I noticed that she was doing so much of her easy running at like not far off her marathon pace. And and she got some advice from my friend to slow them right down. And when she did, she actually saw quite a lot of improvement. So yeah, that's probably the biggest one. I think the second one I would say that I'm really learning right now is I think your diet plays a much bigger role than I originally thought in running. And there's multiple ways to go down this path. There's obviously the weight loss path, which I won't touch too much on, but I think just making sure that you're eating very well and you're timing your carbohydrates quite well with workouts and going into workouts with really good, well sourced, ideally things like pasta, rice, and bread in the sort of 6 to 12 hours before a hard workout, that can play a bigger role than most people realize in one, feeling good in training and actually feeling like you're, running well and your energy is good in training, but then also hitting, consistent paces in training. And if you don't eat well and you don't really think much about your diet, and to be honest, I have been in this boat for many years prior to not long ago. Your workouts become a bit of a hit and miss. Like some of them are good and then some of them aren't good. And then I remember doing a couple of poor workouts last year and then sort of realizing that my carbohydrate intake over the 12 hours leading into this workout was really low. I didn't even really realize. I was just eating a whole lot of, like meat and nuts and stuff in the lead up because I was eating mindlessly. Um, but then when you really think about it and you have a lot of bread and pasta and rice in the sort of window leading up to the workout, your glycogen stores will be much more full, and then as a result, you'll perform better. So there's two little sort of simple nuggets that I think anyone can. They don't have to read into either of those two things. It's just really simple, but just to become more mindful of. And I think both those two things will honestly take you quite a long way. Yeah.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is being mindful of what you're doing is, I think that's related to both those points. And uh, a lot of times when I'm kind of coaching some people through what are some fundamentals that you need to apply to your training just to for those marginal gains and just start getting better without really putting in any more effort, it's just adjustments. Is it's almost not helpful to it's not helpful to think, okay, what could the possible benefit be of me doing this? But it's the being intentional with what you're doing and understanding the purpose. So could you, I think a lot of people would probably focus on like if you're doing really high intensity work too frequently, oh, well, that just means that I increase my risk of injury. So then if I rule out the injury aspect, I can do that and I'll get better faster. But in reality, they're not thinking about, okay, you mentioned zone one and zone two. Both those things are important because they focus on working different systems in your body, and those systems are important. And so thinking about integrating things that focus on different systems, stressing those systems at different times to get different stimulus, and then benefiting from those and rolling that into like a long-term plan is a little bit almost why people hire a financial planner is the same reason you hire a coach, because you know what you need to do. You need to spend less money uh, to have more money in the future. But what the long-term path is, where am I going to put my money so that I can get those marginal gains to stack up into something that's really long-term, going to get me where I want to be. So I think it's relevant to the nutrition aspect as well in a different way, but I think with the training zones, it's super important.
Mm. Yeah, I like the analogy you've made. Analogy, perhaps better word, to the financial planner. I mean, if you're someone that wants to make a lot of money quickly and you have no idea, you might be lured to be trading cryptocurrencies every day, right? Whereas like anyone that has
Yeah.
looking at Bitcoin
High
going,
risk,
wow,
high
I could make,
reward.
yeah, exactly. I could make 10% gain today and make 5 grand or whatever. But anyone that studies it enough and has spent enough time in the space understands that probably the first thing is what you said. It's like spend less money. That's probably the best way. But then anyone that's spent a long time in the game and understands inflation, understands index funds and these things, knows that you should probably put the majority of your money in a pretty low yielding thing, but that's just a little bit ahead of inflation. And so that's a really kind of a good analogy to be like looking at zone one, zone two, and then zone four, five, six, seven. In that if you hit zone five, zone six every day or 5 days a week, yes, you might see a huge gain in 3 or 4 weeks and run a good 5K, but that's not a long-term solution. You will almost certainly pick up an injury. Well, firstly, it's not really touching on the correct aerobic systems either. So you probably won't run a very good half marathon or marathon at all. You might run a pretty good mile or a 3K, but yeah, it's interesting for sure. And that's where a really good coach that has studied for a while comes into play as well. But at the same time, there's lots of resources out there that you can read yourself and you can learn those things. But I think, yeah, it's also something that you have to kind of almost learn your own lessons as well in a way. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I think one of the ways I've tried to translate that same principle into benefits on my end, I've been self-coached for uh, 2 years now, just about, maybe a little bit more than 2 years. And I took some things that I learned from other coaches in like early on in my training when I didn't know what I was doing, and took some of those fundamentals. And then I've realized that there's really specific things that I need to do to raise my ceiling because I don't have the history of running that a lot of other people do, where they know in high school, if you ran a 14:50 5K and you were, a top athlete in high school, you kind of have an idea of where your ceiling's at and where you need to train in order to get to a half marathon or marathon time of X. For me, I don't have that. I've just been every race that I do, I'm just like constantly, unless I have a bad race, I'm improving.
Yeah.
And so the challenge is understanding how do I raise that ceiling, and what role does high intensity high intensity, I guess, speed training, if you, for lack of a better word, fit into a program versus aerobic endurance, raising the ceiling of my aerobic capacity for like a long distance event like a marathon. So that my question to you is, how do you think that an elite athlete deals with those types of things, balancing speed and strength versus endurance when they run several marathons a year, at a really high level? How do they keep improving over time?
Mm. There's a few approaches to take. There's really two main ones though. And it's the first approach is probably the most common approach, but I can see that the second one I'll talk about is becoming more popular. But the first one is basically more volume. That's I mean that's the short answer. And so it's like, well, I ran 2:30 for the marathon. I'm just talking hypothetically, of an individual running 2:30 for the marathon. And I did this much volume. I did 90 miles a week or 150 kilometers a week in the lead up. And I did marathon pace work on one day of the week and then VO2 max threshold work on the other day of the week. And my overall volume was this. Now, I think up until quite recently, the main approach was in order to move the needle forward further, it's probably do a little bit more every single cycle in the hope that that will come down further. The result will come down. But I think as of maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, there's been a sort of new approach to this, which may not be that new. It's just maybe that I sort of noticed it more. And it's to really try and improve on your ability to run at threshold and faster before you start the marathon block. And this is actually what I did this year. So I spent about 6.5 months in the first half of the year, focusing on trying to move the needle forward with basically being faster over the 3K and the mile and the 5K, in the hope that that would mean that my ability to run at LT2 threshold, so my ability to run at a pace where I'm developing the same lactic acid that I can clear with my oxygen, is faster. So that was the entire goal of the first 6.5 months for me. And I was lucky slash successful that it worked. I got to a point in July where my threshold paces were faster than normal. I was able to do tempo runs several seconds per mile faster than previous years, which then I was hoping that that would translate into being able to run slightly faster at even slightly, running slightly faster at speeds below that. So slower than that is what I mean. So my goal was to run a marathon at 5:18 mile pace, which is a 2:19 marathon. And you have to look at your threshold pace to determine if that's really possible or not, because sort of everything revolves around threshold when it comes to, I would argue, especially half marathon and marathon. Sort of 10K, you could argue too. So yeah, I think that speed approach really tries to move the needle forward with getting to that point where you can simply run more efficiently and easier at faster speeds. That's the most simple way to put it. And I'm noticing a lot of people doing that now. So between marathon cycles, typically people will do 2 marathons a year. That's the most common thing to do, one in the
Yep.
fall, one in the spring. But there's too long of a time period between those two marathons to do marathon specific training. Anyone that's tried to do marathon specific training properly will discover that doing anything more than, I would argue, 12 weeks, it's pretty hard if you do it properly because it's very demanding on the body. The long runs are very tough. If you're hitting 20 miles 6, 7 times with a lot of that, or 20 miles to 24 miles with a lot of that at marathon effort, it's really hard to sustain that for a long period of time. And if you do try and sustain it for a long period of time, you also become a little bit. I'll never forget, actually. I know that you're pretty, at least friends with Rory Linkletter. He explained it really well when I had a chat with him. And he's like, if you're giving the same stimulus to someone over and over and over again for many, many months on end, we become very flat somehow, and we almost become really stagnant like that. So throwing in different stimuluses throughout the year. And so I sort of now look at it like if you're going to do 2 marathons a year and it's in October and April, we'll say between those two, there's 6 months. So you should take a few weeks down after maybe the first one. And then you should spend about 2.5. So you've got 5 months to work with, or 5.5 months to work with. You should spend about half that time really working on improving your 3K, 5K, 10K, and then switch over to the marathon block, race, and then repeat. I think that's probably the most common way to look at the entire year of marathoning. And that's what a lot of professionals do. I would say most professionals are doing that same idea now. Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, from my own training, what I've seen work, I couldn't agree more. The I think there's kind of a traditional training methodology, if you will, of starting with, okay, I'm doing a base training block. Maybe I'll do some strides in that base training. Then I'm going to slowly transition to a marathon pace. And, it might be strides, might be the speed work, but there's not really any focus on things that are like really, really uncomfortable, kind of like that VO2 max category. Intervals of 1 minute to 4 to 5 minutes at a time, and you're doing several of them at a very, very high intensity. I think a lot of people kind of shy away from that naturally, but for me, it's been really helpful to do that, like you said, at the beginning of a block, and I've done that a couple years in a row where I start with trying to improve on a 5K time. Then I transition to doing a 10K prior to a half marathon, and then I work up to a marathon, maybe in the fall. And for me, it's been very helpful. And it also gives you a lot of benchmarks along the way to just figure out, like, where am I at? Because a lot of people will just assume that they have a certain level of fitness. And if they don't have a coach, it's even worse because then they're assuming things that are, like kind of contrived in their mind versus something that's on paper and proven. So I think those benchmarks are super important as well for me because I'm constantly having to figure out like where I'm at because I don't have that historic running ceiling, if you will.
Mm. Yeah, and to sort of extend on your point, like this is something that a lot of people don't fully realize. And let's take your times for example. So you've just recently run 2:28, which is right around 3:30 per kilometer or 5:35 per mile. Now, this is something that a lot of people they don't think about it like this. In order to run 3:30, let's just say 3:30 per kilometer. I think it's actually 3:31, but let's just go 3:30 per kilometer. In order to run that for a marathon, that means that you have to be able to run a half marathon at around about 3 317, 318 per kilometer. You're never going to be able to run, if you're running a half marathon at 3:30s, you're never going to be able to run a marathon at 3:30s. The physiology doesn't work. In order to run a half marathon at, let's say, 318 per kilometer, you really need to be able to run a 10K at about 312, 311 per kilometer. If you really want to run a 10K at 312 per kilometer, you really need to be able to run a 5K at about 307 per kilometer. So it really sort of scales back down. And then you start to realize, hey, if I'm running a 5K at 320 per kilometer, there's actually really no chance I can run a marathon at 330 per kilometer. It just doesn't work. The mathematics doesn't work. The paces are just too tight. And so if you think about it like that, that then gives you a really clear understanding as to why it's a good idea to work on your 5K. Because if you can't run the 5K in XYZ time, in your case, 308s, which would be pretty close to 16 flat. I think maybe, no, sorry, that'd be a bit faster than 16 flat, it'd be more like
Yeah, 15 and a
15:35.
half or something.
Yeah,
Yeah.
15:35. Then it's a very slim chance that you can run a marathon in 228 because the
Yeah.
paces are just too hard. And I often think about it like that. And part of the reason why I did this speed block this year was because I was thinking, okay, well, my marathon goal pace is 318 per kilometer, which is 219 marathon. And I realized I couldn't run a 10K at faster than 3 minutes per kilometer, which is 30 flat. I tried a few times and I was always running like 30:30, 30:45, which is like 304, 305. And so I
Yeah.
realized my paces are just too tight. Now, I haven't raced a 10K this year, but I'm almost certain that I could break 30 minutes now if I raced a 10K. And that's just based on workouts like 10 by 1K and these sorts of things. So yeah, it's pretty simple math when you actually think about it like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great visualization for people too. I think a lot of folks don't they just think about what their focus is, which if their focus is the marathon, if you're a 45-year-old marathoner who's running 4 minutes or 4 hours uh every race for your marathons, you kind of just think in terms of marathons, and you think maybe I'm too old to run a fast 5K or 10K, or it's too uncomfortable, it makes my body hurt because of my age or something. But a lot of the folks that I've coached as well in that age category have been really, really surprised with just that shift in focus. Like you said, adding another stimulus and can what it can do, and makes those paces feel a lot more comfortable, which is
Mm,
ultimately the goal. Yeah.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm curious. So shifting to a different topic, altitude training versus other stimuli. I'm a big believer in running when it's hot because I mean, they call heat and humidity poor man's altitude for a reason. And so sometimes I'm suffering from running at 7,000 feet and also 85 degrees and
That combination,
after it
man.
rains, which is terrible. So I'm really curious. Like, what's your outlook on altitude training? How do elites incorporate it? And like, yeah, what's your take on it overall?
Yeah, I think that, by the way, sorry, I interrupted you. That combination of altitude and heat is brutal. It's brutal. I've done it before.
It's
It's really
terrible.
tough. And I saw quite a lot of your content in the summer. It was funny for me to watch, but probably not for you. Um, but I think altitude training is interesting. What's most interesting is I didn't go to altitude this last 4 months, and I ran my marathon personal best. But with that said, I think one thing people don't actually understand about altitude and the actual benefits that you get out of it is if you go to altitude for 3 weeks one time, your hematocrit and hemoglobin will fade away in the next few months and likely not really return to a very high level. But if you're repeatedly going to altitude a lot and you're always sort of going there for a month or two, which is what I've done over the last 5 years, your sort of benchmarks in your body when it comes to utilizing oxygen within the cells actually sort of stays at a moderate to high level for a while. So if I went and got a blood test now or a hematocrit hemoglobin test, mine would probably still be quite a bit higher than the average person because I keep going back to altitude to do work and to run and all these sorts of things. I think across the board, altitude is pretty proven to be pretty beneficial for most people, but there's definitely non-responders. There's definitely some people that actually feel like they have a negative effect for reasons I don't fully understand, but I've heard that a few times. It seems like it's maybe 5 to 10% of people. But there's a reason why most of the best marathoners and 10K and even middle distance runners go to altitude before big races. A lot of them do, and they successfully do it. And I think it definitely is a one percenter. It's definitely something that's likely to not give you too much more benefit than that. But when you're talking about the difference between winning a medal or not winning a medal or coming first and second in the Olympics, that can be a lot of money and it can be a big deal in many other aspects. So I think altitude is very important for most pros. like I said, I didn't go in the last 4 months, but I definitely have not concluded that, oh, it's not for me. That's definitely not where my head's at. But I think you're right when you said that the heat and humidity is a big stimulus. And that's one thing I did have in these last 4 months, in that I stayed in Chicago the entire time, where it's pretty warm and pretty humid. I mean, most workouts I was training in 75 to 80 degrees, which is like 23 to 26 degrees Celsius, and like 90% humidity most days. And I suffered, man. Like, like you were probably having a giggle at some of my complaining on Strava. I was suffering badly. I actually really didn't enjoy it. But there was sort of like a light bulb moment in my mind the day of Chicago Marathon, later in the day, when I realized, because Chicago Marathon wasn't cool. It was about 60 degrees. I think it started at like 58 and finished at about 62, but the humidity was close to 90%. And I ran my personal best in conditions that I never would have thought that I would be able to run a personal best in. But I think that happened because I trained in warmer conditions almost every single day than the race. And when I crossed the line, a fellow Australian was a minute behind me, and he'd already run 2:19 a couple of times in previous years. The first thing he said to me, so he ran 2:20:29. The first thing he said to me was he found it tough out there because he'd trained in the South Australian winter, which is, normally it's 40s, and he came to Chicago and it's 60, and he really struggled. And I didn't struggle so badly because I'd been training in 70s and 80s, and so I think that is a big deal. I've heard buzzwords like blood plasma and blood oxygen and these sorts of things. I don't really understand the science around heat and humidity, but I'd love to. I probably will look into that more, because I do think that that was a pretty big benefit in this last block for me. Yeah. I'd love to hear from you. Like, what more do you know about why that works? Because I do think it is a pretty big deal. Yeah.
I'm in the same boat as you. I don't know exactly why it works, but for me, I just kind of believe in doing things that you really don't like doing, and I think a mental component of it is really big for me. It builds confidence. It builds strength under like really, really challenging mental circumstances, and then also you're forced to fuel your body, hydrate during your training under like pretty rigorous conditions, and then when you get to a race, you end up like I mean, shit's easy. It's just ideal temperatures. You've got whatever. If you've got a bottle with you or you're taking gels, it's a lot easier to do that when your body is not trying to process those things while being under so much physical stress because of the heat and humidity. I know you have a sweat issue that you've looked into a lot. Like heavy sweaters, salty sweaters need to take in a ton of salt, which also can give you a ton of like indigestion type gut issues. So you kind of train yourself and work through a lot of those issues. And then anything that pops up will hopefully pop up in training versus on the day of. And I do believe that the heat just makes you fitter. Like this summer, most of my long runs, I think we ended, even a long run that you and I did, we were ending a 21-mile long run, and it was probably 85 degrees, no shade whatsoever, and relatively dry, but like still like 40% humidity, and we're trying to run pretty hard paces, and you're doing that 2 hours into a long run. It's tough. And then the race feels a lot easier.
Yeah, I suffered badly that day, man. I'm having flashbacks to when I was sitting under that tree at like the 19-mile mark
I know.
for a couple of minutes.
I remember it well. Yeah. But everyone responds differently to it. Like I kind of thrive under that, but I also I know you have asthma issues. I have asthma issues as well, maybe a little bit different from yours, but like really cold weather, just my lungs seize up. I can't breathe very well. I cough very frequently. It creates a lot of mucus in my chest. And so it's snowing right now, and I'm just on the treadmill most of the winter, which it's kind of everyone's got their stuff they got to work through. So it
Yeah.
does make you stronger in the end.
I think you've nailed it with the mental side of the heat. And if you're constantly dealing with running in an uncomfortable mind state, strangely, that is going to pay dividends when it comes to a race if you don't have to run in the same conditions. And I think that's absolutely what happened with me. And it would have been what happened with you, because in Berlin it was pretty good conditions. It was what was it, high 40s.
Yeah.
And you'd been training in the summer in Flagstaff, where you had to deal with the combo, the altitude and the heat combo, which is brutal. It can be very uncomfortable at times. And so, yeah, you ran a massive, a really good race and a big personal best. And I think there is probably a large percentage of that that is not able to be measured in a test. It's like a lot of it could be measured in a test by looking at, different metrics and thresholds and blood lactates and stuff. But a part of it's probably just purely mental. It's like I'm so used to dealing with being really uncomfortable in training because of the conditions, and now it's a lot better. So I feel awesome. And I think the RPE, rate of perceived exertion, is often something that's kind of overlooked, but it's very powerful. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. And up here, like training at altitude as well. I don't want to spend too much time on altitude. I know most people probably don't live at altitude or train at altitude, but it is just constantly challenging, similar to the heat thing. And people up here, professionals, have told me that altitude, it's always going to suck. You're always going to feel slow. You're always going to feel run down during training. But then when you go down, you're just consistently going to be running faster as time progresses, and I found that to be true with myself as well.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good insight for sure. It's fascinating how it works. There's so many little different things to do with this game, and I think the marathon is where it gets really interesting because in a 10K, you know, the marathon requires it's I feel like it's so much more mental because you have to deal with that, and especially in the fact that most marathons, even some majors, I would even argue Chicago's a bit like this. The last 15K, I mean, in Chicago, there's a fantastic crowd for most of it, but in the last 15K of Chicago, but especially smaller marathons, you often have to run on your own as well. And that's really tough mentally to do, to push yourself as hard as you can when no one's around. There's some dark thoughts that get into your mind, like, why am I doing this? Like, especially if you start to have low glucose and your brain starts to turn and you're running low on glucose. It's tough, man. It's really hard, but it's part of the game and it's part of the beauty of the marathon for sure.
Yeah, I definitely I went through that in Berlin with you'd assume there's like so many people to run with in a marathon like Berlin. I think it was like 58,000 people participated in the marathon. And but I found myself alone because a lot of times depending on what paces you're running, depending on if you're an elite with pacers, which a lot of, like, I was running in a pack with a lot of women who are maybe in the elite field, they have pacers. They're pretty consistent. They're kind of progressing the whole way, which is great. But that was pretty aggressive for me at the beginning. And then also toward the end, they're, kind of progressing at a rate that maybe I wasn't comfortable with. I'm usually pretty conservative. I run pretty even paced, and people, but a lot of the other people, they either run really hard at the beginning, then they die at the end, or vice versa. And so you can find yourself just kind of by yourself, not really with a pack to run in. And I definitely hit a point where my quads were not as strong as I thought they were, and it was a mental battle for about 6K. But that's what the training's for. I'll do it better
And you
next time.
and you still held pace pretty well. Like you almost even split, right? I remember seeing you on the tracker.
I negative split by like four
Yeah.
seconds actually.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
right. Yeah, yeah.
surprising.
So for
But
some reason, you go.
it is. I think it's because around halfway, I started feeling really, really good, and that 325 per K pace felt really, really good. And I held that up to like 32, maybe 34K, and then I started slowing down a little, but I only managed to slow down by like I think I was running probably 332 per K or something, through those last bits. So it wasn't too
Mm.
bad. Yeah.
Can I ask you, I'm curious, and this is interesting for any listeners, how much fuel did you take on board between 10K and 30K?
Uh, I'll just tell you the whole thing. So I started
Yeah,
with a
yeah, that's
bottle,
easy.
Morton 160 in a bottle with like 16 ounces or 14 ounces of water, which is like 500 mLs. And so I hit that
How many
through
grams
it,
of carbs is that? Do you know?
7K, 40 grams of carbs,
40.
around 40, around 7K. I finished it. So it's like 40 minutes or something like that.
Hmm.
And I finished that. I was aiming for about 60 grams of carbs per hour. The challenging part is because they were serving Morton on course, there's like no salt in Morton, which drives me absolutely bananas. I don't know how they managed to do that, but in training, I would take a little measuring thing with pink Himalayan salt and add it into my Morton. Didn't have, I did that in my first bottle. So I probably had like 350 milligrams of salt in my first bottle. And then I was just gels the whole way. And then taking, they had 160s in little cups, but you barely get any when you're, it's
Hmm.
one every 2 miles. You barely get anything.
Hmm.
So I did 4 gels after that one bottle, plus sipping the 160 on course. So 4 gels, and they were 40-gram gels. So 4 times 40, yeah,
Is it,
160.
so the gels have 40 grams of carbs?
Morton 160s, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So you've had about
So
200 grams.
I think I did, yeah, probably like 185 grams because I think I took one of the smaller gels from the course.
Yep. Okay. Yeah.
Um,
Interesting. Okay. Yeah.
so
That's
yeah, I don't know.
six.
That's a little bit of math for me right now, but yeah.
Yeah. I'm curious to know what I'm interviewing you now. Where did you come up with the 60 grams an hour?
It's just been what's been working in training. So
Okay.
I've been uh I would usually in training for like a 2 hour long run, I would have two bottles, each with a Morton 160 in each bottle, and I'd have like one gel in addition to those, and a bottle of water. And I would usually be able to finish most of that in a 2 hour to 2 hour 15 minute training run.
Nice. Yeah. Okay. I am
But
curious to see how you would respond to a little bit higher, but who knows? It's quite individual. But yeah.
yeah, I've it's been the most I've been able to stomach because I've had some gut issues in
Okay.
the past. But because of a lot of like diet and nutrition adjustments I've made, I've been able to. I'm like 85% better than I was maybe a year and a half ago,
Awesome.
gut wise. So yeah, it's
Okay.
been good. But
Awesome.
yeah, I would. I'm going to constantly be trying to up it. My philosophy on the fueling is if you have the opportunity to take more, take it in training, see how you feel, and then hopefully it it comes down to logistics in a race. I think a lot of it, like if you're not in an elite field, how much can you carry? What's the form that you can get in? Can someone
Totally.
drop a bottle on course or what? So it's
Put it
challenging.
put the bottle on the ground and you pick it up so it's not illegal.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I've had my wife successfully pass me two bottles in the Santa Rosa Marathon like several years ago, and that was amazing. I did actually, I bonked that race. Funny
Oh,
enough.
oh damn.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I've got a couple other questions I wrote down for you because I want to
Yeah.
make sure.
Yeah, of
Uh,
course.
so in terms of okay, like a day-to-day basis versus long-term planning, I'm curious when you talk to and interview an elite athlete, and we're talking, when I say elite, I mean someone who is an Olympic level athlete,
Hmm.
the day-to-day planning of what workout am I doing today versus 3 days from now? Um, Maybe what are some of those like key workouts that I need to get done versus the long-term growth of like, I want to get X amount of long runs at this pace, at this distance, over this block, and I want to end up at this time, or even further out, like racing along the way to get to a certain goal. I'm curious, how important is that like day to day planning where someone's saying, oh, am I going to do 10 by 800 or am I going to do 15 by 800?
Mm.
Or is it the long term that's more impactful?
I would say the long term is probably a little bit more impactful than the actual specifics of the day to day, but they're both very important. The day to day is absolutely very important, but I think across the board, the thing that it's sort of a little bit event specific as well, because for an 800-meter runner, it's a little bit different to a marathon runner. I think the 800-meter really wants to try and hit their key specific workouts as well as good as possible. And in the example of an 800-meter runner, they might have a key workout of like three 600s at 800-meter pace. It's not ideal. I get the vibe that from most of them, if you do two and miss the third due to either going out too hard or not feeling good or whatever, that's a little bit of a bummer. Whereas if it's a marathon runner and they set out to do 10 by a mile and they get to eight and they feel fatigued, it tends to be less of a big deal. But what's a bigger deal is looking at the bigger picture and understanding, okay, we're getting in 120 miles a week. So I'm speaking about like a real Olympic athlete here. That's probably about what most Olympic athletes would do volume wise in the marathon, at least. And we're getting in like you said, like 8 long runs of 20 to 24 miles with 20 to 40% of that volume at marathon effort or marathon pace, or if you're altitude or whatnot. So both important, but I think the longer you go, the longer the event is, probably the more importance is placed on the longer term view and the longer consistency. Because I think as a marathon runner, if you're doing pretty high volume and you're ticking off a lot of long runs, you're going to go a long way with your marathon running. But in order to really get the most out of yourself and to find your absolute peak, it's then about trying to get it all to come together. Whereas in the 800 meters, you probably won't go that far by doing volume. You really need to be able to run very fast at pace. And so that means the specifics in the quality workouts become the real priority. Yeah. But I mean, I've seen, and I've even been filming a few workouts. I wouldn't say lots, but a few workouts where the workout will be planned to be, yeah, workouts such as 10 by 1K. And then after eight, they'll pull the workout. They'll be like, that's enough. We've done enough. That even happened to one Paul Chelimo workout that I filmed, who's obviously an Olympic medalist. I don't remember right now what the workout was. I think it was 800 repeats. But I do remember that they cut the workout short a little bit, and he was happy with it. He was just like, "Yep, I know they felt good, but I don't need to do any more right now. A little bit
Yeah.
fatigued, blah blah blah." I think he was dealing with a very minor Achilles pain as well. Yeah, so I hope I answered the question there, but I think absolutely the longer the distance, the more the long term view is a bigger deal. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, the reason I ask that is because I've coached, a handful of people consistently, like 5 to 8 people over the last like several years. And I think personality comes into play a
Oh
lot.
yeah.
And
Oh yeah.
uh, a lot of people I've noticed get really obsessed over the day to day and they kind of lose sight over the long term, which is really important because if we're thinking about consistency and striving toward long term goals, the long term is very important to focus on. But also, some people might benefit from like, okay, we're going to get really specific. If you have a lot of trust with someone, you know that they're going to execute well in a workout. Asking them for feedback and being able to adjust things and say, if you do 8 by 1K and you're like, hey, I could do three more, four more of these. Great. More volume, more exposure at certain intensities in a lot of cases is a good thing. But that's where I feel like the communication is super important and just the having that long-term plan and a common understanding of what that is and how you're going to get there. It's like the intentionality that we talked about is just so key.
Yeah, you said that very well. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. So what are your next race plans, Matt?
I got a marathon in 2 days, less than 48 hours.
Let's
So
go.
yeah, I'm excited for this one, because you already mentioned that I'm a heavy sweater. I have a very high sweat rate. I overheat very, very easily. And I love racing in the cold. Up until Chicago Marathon 4 weeks ago, my best two races were in temperatures which was a feels like pretty close to 32 or 0 degrees Celsius
Oh,
freezing
it's so
point.
cold.
Yeah, and every rate, it was if I really mapped out all my marathons over the last 7 years, it was almost like a clear indication that the colder the weather, the better I ran. It was almost that obvious. And so the reason why I'm saying this is because Indianapolis in 2 days, the forecast is going to be like high 30s, which is not quite as cold as I have raced in, but it's pretty close. But it's also going to be overcast with no sun exposure. So that's going to be very, very, it's going to feel very cold. And yeah, I'm in the shape of my life. I just ran 219 at I mean, this sounds a bit weird, but I don't think I went 100% effort in that 219. I probably went about 95% effort. And the reason why I did that was because I still haven't figured out how to manage the muscle cramping. And I had quite a lot of cramping in the last 10K. And anyone that's been dealing with muscle cramping pretty relentlessly knows that it's actually really hard to push to your physical limit when you're cramping because your muscles are contracting and you can't move. Now, someone on the other side of the debate might go, yeah, but that means you're at your limit. But anyone that has been cramping for the last 10K would know that you simply don't feel like you are pushing as hard as you can. Now, your muscles might have given up for whatever reason, but the part of the reason why I've raced well in the cold is because I sweat way less and I don't need to take anywhere near as much sodium and fluid. And then as a result, I cramp much later and much less than normal. And so I'm just really hoping that happens this weekend. And I'm really going to roll the dice this weekend. I'm going to go out in like 108 low, which is on pace for 216, 217. And I've never gone out that fast before, but I feel confident that I can do that and finish running around that time. But you've done a few marathons. I've done a lot of marathons. Who knows what's going to happen? The marathon's a mysterious event where sometimes you can get to 20 miles and feel horrendous when you thought you'd feel great. And sometimes it can be the total other way around. You can feel amazing when you're expecting to feel kind of rough. So I'm just hoping that it's a good day out there. But yeah, it starts, what is it right now? It's like 1 p.m. We're kicking off at 8 a.m. in 2 days. So hopefully in a couple of days' time, I have a faster time than 219, but let's see.
Very cool, man. Well, I'm looking forward to following along. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Good luck.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, there's a tracking app, same as most apps, same as most events, sorry. So yeah. Let's see how it goes.
Great. Well, I really appreciate you joining me, man. Hopefully people can take a lot from this. Thanks everyone for listening. Happy running.
Thanks, guys.